All right, good morning. Today we are going to start looking into the final push of Jesus's great Galilean ministry. So there's one detail from that second tour of Galilee on the busy day that we didn't wrap up last week. So we will wrap that up this morning, and then we'll get into Jesus's third tour of Galilee, and this will be done next week in terms of his time in Galilee. So when we look at this, I'll show you on the schedule how this kind of breaks down. It's somewhat interesting how the Gospels focus so much time on certain things and then not as much on others. So we have been right now looking at this great Galilean ministry. We started it in mid-November. We did have our Christmas break there. We've gone through the month of January. Now we are picking up here. We're on lesson 15 today, and we will have next week. And so we have two very kind of interesting. Every lesson in my mind is interesting, but today we're going to be looking at some things that really are going to be leading up to this conclusion of Jesus's ministry public ministry as he starts this third trip through Galilee. And then next week we will really wrap this up. And when we look at that, we'll look at the feeding of the 5,000. We will also next week look at when Jesus walked on the water. That's where I kind of have a contribution to the studies of the life of Christ that I'll share, and also my life verse we'll cover next week. And some of my personal testimony behind that verse. So that'll be a little bit interesting, maybe a little bit emotional, a little bit. Try not to get too bad with it. Hold it together. But so that'll be next week. But this week we are going to pick up where we left off last time. So last time we were talking about Jesus's busy day. Remember, we concluded that Jesus was he taught in parables. I'll pull up the map here because we will be looking at this map a few times today. So he was in Capernaum. He had taught in parables. Remember, he had gotten into the boat. He left his house. He taught the people. Then he went back into the house. Then later that evening, he gets back in the boat, and he's going to go across to basically, he has a divine appointment with a demoniac who's possessed with a legion of demons. All right. And so we'll talk about that briefly to wrap up that section. And this is, again, part of Jesus' busy day. There's all kinds of sections of the scriptures, the pericopes and the gospels, where we cover, in a 6-month period may elapse over the course of a chapter, right? I've talked about these pericopes, go next to each other, one by one by one. We lose sight of the fact 6 months have transpired. Here we have a whole series of them, and they all happen in one day. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here when we look at Jesus's busy day. And so let's just pick up here for a minute. Notes would be helpful as well. So let me open up Logos as well. Thankfully, I'm not too tight to notes. The notes are really to prevent me from forgetting details I don't want to forget. All right. Going to Logos, we will start with Jesus stilling the sea. We talked about that last time. We made the comparison to Jonah. And now let's talk a little bit about, we'll start in Matthew. Actually, it should be Matthew 8, I believe. 8. Yeah, cast out demons. Okay. So when he came to the other side, so now that was the map that I showed you, he goes to, we're going to look at this map. I mentioned last week that there's a problem with this map, and there's actually kind of an interesting issue here. with textual criticism and our manuscripts with the Gospels and this map and what the text actually tells us. And so we'll talk about that briefly. We won't solve it here. But there is some interesting things about this. And I'll talk a little bit about textual criticism. I'll save most of my textual criticism topics, though, for an interesting passage coming up in John at another lesson. All right. So he came to the other side into the country of the Gadarenes. Uh, Two men who were demon possessed, met him as they were coming out of the tombs. And they were so extremely violent that no one could pass by that way. And they cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now there was a herd of many swine feeding at a distance from them. The demons began to entreat him, saying, "If you are going to cast us out, send us into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." And they came out and went into the swine, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the waters. The herdsmen ran away and went into the city and reported everything, including what had happened to the demoniacs. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they implored him to leave their region. Now, one thing that should be noted here is that when Jesus goes on the map to this demoniac, he's going into, remember everything over on this side, down south, the east, the northeast, is all Gentile region. So he's been rejected nationally by the Jews. This is the same day where they've had the unpardonable sin. They've attributed Jesus's works to the devil. And so now he goes over to this Gentile area. It's kind of like, okay, there's other reasons why Jesus is doing this, divinely appointments here, but it's almost like he's like, okay, I'm done with you guys. I'm going over to the Gentiles. And it's kind of a vague picture of that the Gospels present. And so that's kind of what's going on here. So now that I got my notes opening up, I will talk a little bit more about this. Now, I want to go to Mark as well, and Matthew, because we're going to talk about some of the differences. So this was Matthew. Now let's go to Mark. And in Mark, it says, "And they came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes, and he got out of the boat. Immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him, and he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to, or no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains and gashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, 'What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I implore you by God, do not torment me.' For he had been saying, 'Come out of the man, you unclean spirit.' And he was asking, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'My name is Legion, for we are many.' And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, 'Send us into the swine so that we may enter them.' Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, to about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea." And looking at Luke, he will talk a little bit more about this. Uh, okay, so same thing here. Luke he has them. They were in the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee, and he came out of the land. Now there was a herd of many swine. I'm dropping down to verse 32. They're on the mountain. The demons implored him to permit him to enter the swine. He gave them permission. The demons came out of the man and entered into the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. So basically, they run off the cliff. Now, first off, what do you notice about the differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke in this account? Correct. There's two men in Matthew. So let's talk about that. There's two men in Matthew, and um, part of the reason for that, again, is this is kind of interesting because Matthew is usually the one that summarizes and leaves out details. But here it appears that Matthew has given us a little bit more detail that there was actually two people. And Mark and Luke, in this case, are kind of just summarizing and focusing on one particular demoniac. So that would be, definitely a reasonable thing to do. There's just a summary there. It doesn't make the scriptures any less believable or challenging. It's just the fact that Matthew, in a rare case, is actually giving us more detail than the other gospels do. But now there's another issue here, which is actually a little bit more difficult. Um, the locations are different, right? So one of them says that it was Gadara, or the Gadarenes. The other ones say it was Gerasa, and for the Gerasenes. So which is it? It's interesting because when you look at the manuscripts for our Gospels, um, there are Matthew has Gadara in the text in the manuscript, and there is and Mark and Luke have Gerasa, and that's in the text, in the earliest manuscripts that we have, and so they are different there. There's also a third variant, Gergesa, aka Cursa, Cursi, which I'm going to show you on the map. You can see here, there's Cursi, okay? Some manuscripts have that one as well. But the problem there is the manuscripts that have that name don't have, I mean, we don't have anything until after Origen. So Origen, 3rd century, he speculated or had some reason for saying that there was a different place that was actually the original intent, and so he went with it, and people it got into the manuscripts, when scribes, somewhere it's like, oh well, Origen said it was this actually. So we have a set of manuscripts where it was adjusted with a different geographic name. So we can't look at the texts right now and make a conclusive determination because the way the manuscripts work, you'll have the primary manuscript or primary manuscripts for the Gospels, and then they'll have the primary reading, you know, Gesera or Gerasa. But they might have a secondary reading for the one that's in Matthew, right? Because someone realized they're different. And so then we might have a set of manuscripts that have different a reference that have something different. What's odd is the Gospels that have the different names, they're in the same codex. So we look at Aleph, we look at Vaticanus, Alexandrinus. Well, they all have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they have John too. And in their being put together, when they were made, they have a different location. So it's kind of interesting. But getting back to the map, There is Gadara way down here. There's another Gadara. This was like 25 miles away. This one's a little closer. So it's like Jesus surely didn't, in his busy day, come on shore and then go 25 miles down here. But also, look at this picture. Look at this map. What's wrong with this map, the way that it's drawn, the route it suggests that Jesus took, and the narrative that we read? What does the narrative tell us about the pigs? They ran off the cliff, ran off a steep bank. That's not what we have down here. Where are the mountains? Where's the cliffs? They're along the side here, right? So, most likely, origin was close. There is most likely the place where they ran off and where this all occurred is somewhere along the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. Because if you go there, if you've been there geographically, that makes sense. Down here, it doesn't make sense. So modern kind of conjecture would be if we do enough archaeology, we'll probably find another place some here or along here with the name Gadara, Gerasa, and that would be the place. It's just we haven't found it yet. Now there is this Kersey. Maybe it is that. Maybe it is that location, and Origin just got the name wrong. That's quite possible. Um, all that to say, I think that this line should be coming over here somewhere, as opposed to down south. And we can't resolve which one of those names is actually correct, but sometimes names change too. So it doesn't mean that there's an error. They could both be right. They could have been known by two different names. In Jericho, you can have two different places with the same name because sometimes people moved and kept the same name, right? So, actually, have I confused everybody, or does that make sense? All right. So this is the route that Jesus took for the busy day. So he was in Capernaum. He comes across. He's going to heal the demoniacs, cast out the legion of demons. The pigs run off the cliff, drowned, and then they say, "Get away from us! Please go home. Go back to where you came from." And so then Jesus gets back in his boat with the disciples, and they go back across. Okay, and so now that's where we pick up. Yeah. Yeah. Well, they were amazed at what Jesus did in terms of demoniac, but they just lost 2,000 pigs. You know what I'm saying? So that's their whole economic wealth. It's like, it's kind of like, I appreciate that you cured my disease, but my Vanguard account is gone. You know what I'm saying? So we can stop here. You know what I'm saying? And so that's kind of the situation here that they're if they didn't suffer that significant financial impact, negative for them, I'm sure they would have had him kill somebody else. Um, all right. Does that answer a little bit? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, it depends on the wind and how much you have to row. Um, yeah, yeah, but I mean, Yeah, it's not a long route. Yeah. It's like, I think maximum is like 7 by 13, I think. So
Can talk a bit about the demons, about why do they want to be either a man or a pig, or why is that preferable to them rather than floating around looking for the coast? What's going on?
good question. So for the camera, because this is a question I can't answer, well, I can repeat. Um, Doug's asking why the demons prefer to be in possession of someone or something, whether it be a person or a pig. And I can't answer that. I didn't study that specifically, so um, yeah, I don't know. So that was an easy question. All right. So with that, we're going to pick back up where we would left off. And so now let's talk about where we're at in terms of the chronology and the timeline. So we have here again, we're nearing the end of Jesus' Galilean ministry, and it's going to be over in 2 or 3 months, and we'll finish that up next time. Today we'll look at that final push into Galilee, and we look at the calendar here. Uh, the feeding of the 5,000, John tells us, happens when the Passover was near. So we'll look at this next week. And so that's going to be during the month of Nisan, because Passover is actually on the 15th of Nisan. The 14th is when the 10th, they set aside the lamb. The afternoon of the 14th, they sacrifice it. Then at sunset, which would be the 15th, because Jewish days start at sunset, they eat dinner. So Passover actually is on Nisan 15. So we're probably a couple months before that, 2 or 3 months before the feeding of the 5,000, which would then put us about January of AD 32. So somewhere there, Shavat would be, or or actually, or Tevet, yeah. So that would be the month that we're in. Again, remember they use a lunar calendar for the Jews at this time. And so the months are the same length, but when there's kind of an interesting process they go through to determine the first of the month. So new moon comes, there's no moon in the sky, it's dark. And then every night they go out and they look at the sky. And if they get any sign of looking at the sky and they can see a sliver of the moon, because the new month started. But if they can't see anything, then they look the next day. Okay. And as soon as they see that sliver, the rabbis come back and say, okay, we've started the new month. But what if it's cloudy? Right? So they can actually shift a day or two. So when we do some of this chronology and matching, everything might be off just like a day or two from our Julian dates, just because we don't know when they determine the month, the sun, the moon came out. Okay, so we're about January of AD 32. Today we're going to look at miracles, 3 of them for faithful Jews, the final visit to unbelieving Nazareth, the sending out of the 12, 2 by 2, and the beheading of John the Baptist. And with that, we'll also look at Herod's messed up family tree. Okay. All right. So 3 miracles of faith, or 4 faithful Jews. Remember that at this point, it is well established that Jesus can perform miracles. He can heal people. He can cast out demons. So Jesus' power is generally not the focus at this point. When the Gospels are recording miracles, there's another point that's being made. And in this case, the focus is on the faith of those whom Jesus helps. So again, kind of like last time, but here there's going to be a difference. Here, instead of going to Gentiles or helping out Gentiles who were believing, in contrast to the Jewish crowds, here the Jewish crowds have rejected Jesus. That represents the national rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. But there are still individual Jews who are faithful, who recognize who Jesus is. I mentioned Nicodemus as an example last week. Today we'll see three instances again of others where this is true as well. And the first one is Jairus. So we'll start with Jairus, and we'll go and we'll look at it here, and I'll go to let's go to Matthew. And we will be in Matthew, and we'll be in chapter 9. Okay. And we have a block of these together. Now, while he was saying these things, so this is right after he gets back, from the lake and all of that, across the lake and all of that. He's speaking to the crowds again, and a synagogue official came and bowed down before him. Synagogue official, he's Jewish, and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." So here we have this faithfulness of the synagogue official, obviously recognizing who Jesus is, probably aware of what he did for the centurion's family, for his slave, as well as the resurrection that he did in Nain for the widow. Remember, he came into Nain and he just, out of the blue, resurrects the widow's son in the middle of the funeral procession. So this will be the second resurrection that Jesus performs. And so he's going to go, and he's going to go to this person's home and revive his daughter. Now, interestingly, along the way, there is an interruption. So I'll show you the picture here just to kind of make it. So here's Jesus. He's in this crowd. Remember, again, there's nowhere that Jesus goes where he's not surrounded by a crowd. He can't be alone. And we have a picture here, this artist's depiction of this woman just reaching, trying to touch Jesus to be healed. And she is. So we'll come back to this, but I just wanted to touch base with it as we read through the account. And a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, "If only I touch his garment, I will get well." But Jesus, turning and seeing her, "Daughter, take courage. Your faith has made you well." At once, the woman was made well. When Jesus came into the official's house and saw the flute players and the crowd in noisy disorder, he said, "Leave, for the girl has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But when the crowd had been sent out, he entered and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. This news spread out throughout all the land. All right, so let me go real quickly to, let's go to Luke. We'll go to Luke chapter 8. So when Jesus returned, again crossing the lake, people welcomed him, for they had been waiting for him. So he got in the boat, he's going to come back. So they're just waiting. And there came a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue, fell at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. So here we got a little point where Matthew is probably summarizing again. Luke and Mark give us more detail. Here's a case. Matthew, as he typically does, is summarizing. They say she was dead. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him, and a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years. Interesting that the woman had a hemorrhage for the same age as the girl, 12 years old. And for that whole time of her life, this woman has had this problem. Could not be healed by anyone, So they've done all their uh, pre-medieval medicine, ancient medicine, came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone did touch me, for I was aware that the power had gone out of me." And Mark, he kind of phrases it as, "What do you mean? There's people all around you. Why you ask who touched you?" And this is the kind of detail that adds historical credibility to the Gospels. We trust them because they're inspired, but even as historical accounts, these fall into the category of like unnecessary detail information. We didn't need to know that everybody was crowding around. But that's kind of part of the point. It's like, hey, you're surrounded by people, which is why I showed you that picture earlier. People are bumping into you all over the place. Uh, it's kind of like if you ever go to the Vatican and take the tour through the standard tour. That was the first time we went. Don't ever do that. It's worth the money to go on a little more private session before they open. Because, yeah, you're just like,
Yeah.
and you're surrounded by people. The first time we did it, we had Caleb with us, and he actually, it was 2016, he got claustrophobic. He had to go into the bathroom and, it didn't feel well because it's just so crowded. And my niece was with us, and she had spent a year in Beijing. She didn't mind the crowds. She's used to, I haven't been to New York really, and so maybe it's that way in the big cities. I don't think so. I think we all like our distance here in America. Don't touch me. But yeah. So anyway, someone touches him, this woman. And while they were all denying it, again, Peter said, "What do you mean? You're crowding around you?" She said, "Someone touched me." And when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling and fell down before him and declared in the presence of the people the reason why she had touched him, how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." And while he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." But when Jesus heard this, he answered, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe, and she will be made well." Well, death is not something you make well, right? The making well is typically gone at that point. When he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him except Peter, John, and James. So here we see this inner circle with Jesus and the girl's father and mother. Now, when they were all weeping and lamenting for her, he said, "Stop weeping." Excuse me. "For she has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him, knowing that she had died. And so here's a hermeneutical principle I can demonstrate. When we read something and it's not clear, first rule, hermeneutics, keep reading, right? Because it's like, it's clear that she's died. Jesus makes a reference, well, she's asleep. We'll talk about why Jesus phrases it that way. But is she really dead? Or is she just in some kind of deep sleep? Well, no. It says, and they began laughing at him, knowing that she had died. Okay, it's clear. Yahweh took her by the hand and called, said, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned. I mean, her spirit came back. I mean, her spirit was gone. And now her spirit is here again, right? So because of that, and she got up immediately. So I think Luke uses that phrase pretty clearly to say her spirit was gone. That's the definition of being dead. And her spirit came back. So if you are in the medical procedure and you're like code lined and they bring you back, your spirit never left you. But if you flatline and you don't come back, your spirit is gone. And so in this case, her spirit comes back. Her spirit did leave and came back. Yeah.
read about says you have faith. Faith is you, isn't it? He doesn't have faith that in the sense of self. I read this that it's faith in Jesus. Jesus is doing the healing. Or anyway, would you discuss that
Yeah, yeah, I will. I'm going to circle back around and I'll talk about that. But yes. So he says, "Child, arise," and her spirit returned. She got up immediately. He gave orders to give her something to eat. She's been through quite an ordeal. And her parents were amazed, but he instructed them to tell no one what happened. Really kind of an unreasonable request. I mean, the whole house had people here, probably hired mourners. Everybody knows she was dead, and now she's not. Okay, Jesus, we'll keep that one a secret. So sometimes, yeah. What? It's a sense of humor, exactly. Well, and and he does say some of these things um, to kind of, I think, just kind of soften the context. He's being sensitive, compassionate. It's like, what's easier to say? Your sins are forgiven, or get up and walk. But just so you know that the Son of Man has the ability to forgive sins, get up and walk, right? Um, so there's some of that going on. Rick,
whole crowd that got that and it didn't allow them to come in. So he had plausible deniability. If he may have really sincerely wanted to not really let them. That's kind of a miraculous. He has some deniability there. Somebody there saw that and he said, "Yes."
yeah, I'm not going to buy that. I'm not going to buy that.
At some point, he doesn't want to just be known for miracles. He wants to be known, you know what I mean? Like he's a magician. He's walking around. He can do all these and also there may be something about not wanting to bring attention to that family. You know what I mean? Like people
Yeah.
be like, "You were dead. We know you were." I don't
So let's
passion inside of that as well. Family.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about not the compassion part, but that first part, because
Yeah.
we are going to start seeing a shift where Jesus doesn't want the attention. And so next week we'll conclude that. I mean, he's going to feed 5,000 people at one time, and then that's going to be a massive turning point in Jesus's ministry, um, and for the worse. And so he will have this situation where he doesn't want to do things publicly anymore. He doesn't want to be in a crowd. I don't want to steal too much what's coming. Um, but just notice here, going back to the schedule. We talked about this long period. We've had number of lessons here on this year and a half in Galilee. Then we're going to cover the next three lessons after next week. We'll have three this is a 6-month period. And then the next two, this is a 6-month period. So we're going to cover a year in 5 weeks because that's how the Gospels emphasize it. And during that year, most of that time, definitely the first 6 months, the second 6 months, it's kind of a mix. Yeah, Jesus is not trying to draw attention to himself anymore because he doesn't want people to believe in him for the wrong thing. And we're going to see that next week after the feeding of the 5,000. Because they're all following him for the wrong reason, which is your point. Okay. All right, so let's just recap here. So Jairus' daughter is resurrected. Jairus is a synagogue official. Like Nicodemus, there were Jewish religious leaders who believed in Jesus. Mark and Luke both say that his daughter is on the brink of death. Matthew says that she died, in summary. Notice that the faith Jairus demonstrates in Mark 5:23, just lay your hands on her. Went to Mark. We'll just go to Mark real quick. Mark 5:23. He says, implored him earnestly, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live. Absolutely has faith. To your question about faith, because it's the common theme here, these people believe in who Jesus is and what he can do. you can't really separate those two. You know, there are those who just have a superficial belief. You know, they look at Jesus as a miracle worker or whatever, some kind of magician. But when you're talking about someone's dead or, you know, on the brink of death, even, um, this is like someone just says, I know if you just touch her, it's not like, come do something, whatever, you know, it's like, hey, I know if you just touch her, she'll be well. So this is a recognition of not only what Jesus can, well, it's first off who he is and what he can do. And I struggle with being able to separate those two. I think it's hard for anyone to have faith in what Jesus can do without having faith in who he is. Okay. So the girl dies again while she's en route. We talked about that. Let's talk a little bit about this Mark Talitha cum. So Mark wanted to go ahead and tell us the quote here. Yeah. So, Talitha cum, yeah, in 41, which translates mean, little girl, I say to you, get up. Luke says it more concisely, like, you know, girl, get up. That's kind of what it means here. It's Aramaic, but gives us an opportunity to do a little bit of Hebrew as well. So the Talitha, that's where we get this little girl. But the word cum means to rise, arise, to get up, to stand. And it's the same word in Hebrew and Aramaic because they're both Semitic languages. They're very closely related. And so in this case, uh, it actually is the same in Hebrew as well. All right, just a little side note. We talked about her spirit returning to her. So now let's go to the widow and talk a little bit more about the widow. So it's along the way to Jairus's home. And again, Jesus is walking in this crowd, which this picture helps us visualize. And she had a long-term medical condition referred to as a hemorrhage. And she worked at she suffered at the hands of ineffective practitioners and treatments for 12 years. And as she did that, her condition only got worse. Um, so that's what's happening here. And her faith statement is in Mark 5:28, if I just touch his garments, I will be made well. Now, Jesus obviously notices that despite the crowds pressing in on him, he feels the power go out of him, which is kind of interesting, you know. Who knows what that feels like? You know what I'm saying? But everybody's bumping into him, but there was something special about that woman's touch. And um, and then what's amazing is here we are talking about the Son of God. He's in this crowd, people are bumping into him, and it's one of these moments where you see the divinity and the humanity of Jesus because he's surrounded by people, they're bumping into him, someone touches him, and he feels this power go out of him and heal this woman, and then he turns around, who was it? Who was it that touched me? And you're like, what do you mean, Jesus? You just healed her. You don't know who it was? And that's pretty incredible, too. You think about it. The Son of God can actually heal people without knowing who they are. Um, and so he's like, okay, who was it? Who was it? No, I'm sure. I mean, once he saw it, I mean, he knew once, you know, but there's that balance between divinity and humanity. We have this moment where somebody touched me. I don't know who it was. And so anyway,
You should, and that needs what's going on there? Is it woman's faith alone is able to get this power, or is it doesn't sound right?
What do you what? I see your hand, Don. I'll come back. Yeah. Well, I mean, the woman had faith again, who Jesus is and what he could do. So that's clear. What to me, if you're proposing to explore more about how Jesus didn't know who that was, I don't know how you explore that any deeper than that. I mean,
Like
he's the God man. That's it. That's the answer.
said, he didn't know who the woman was. Didn't know. He said, "This power left."
Okay. Right. Hold on. Yeah. Go ahead.
His way of demonstrating to others her faith, making it public. Not just I didn't know, but hey, look at this. This woman had so much faith. It was just another opportunity to point out, look at this woman's faith.
Nah, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I appreciate what you're trying to say, and I think we're maybe looking at this in modern time. We look at how Jesus was when Jesus wanted to say something or call something out. He wasn't shy about it. You know, we're in this whole crowd. It's like, who touched me? And he didn't go, where is she? You know, where's the one? You know, he could have very graciously, which Jesus could be very gracious. He could have turned and said, okay, and he would have known who the woman is, or he could have followed her. He could have, like, if she had just stepped back, well, she's on the ground. It appears in the picture.
Chance. And it was in public. He gave her that chance to stand up and say, okay.
Yeah. And then we're getting into I mean, we're never trying to say what was Jesus's psychology and motives for that. What we can say is Jesus clearly says, "Who was it that touched me?" And
Him.
hold on, Rickson.
I was going to say the same thing, only because I was going to read the part of the notes.
What's that? That
He called her out in order to publicly let her proclaim her
yeah, I wouldn't. I
faith.
that's one hypothesis. I would say that this is an expression of Jesus' humanity here.
Problem is, it sounds like that the woman's faith, somehow or another, is comparable to God. Because you could draw, you could draw.
Well, if you get, I think you're using the word. You're tying the faith to the power. Yeah, I don't know what. Again, I wouldn't do that because the power is. I mean, the woman believed. Jesus supernaturally heals her. This is a supernatural, instantaneous healing. He responded because of her faith. We don't want to turn faith into some magical power. Go ahead.
I was thinking that the context of where this is going, we get to a point where he's saying that people are following him for the wrong reasons, that he's surrounded by all these people that are bumping into him, and but all of them are there for most of them, all of them are there for the wrong reason. This woman clearly is not. She's there because she believes her faith in God is going to heal her, and that's why she wants to touch him. Everybody else bumping into him is not there for the right reason. He felt differently when she touched him.
Exactly.
Her faith. Everybody else touching him was there for one reason. That's why I think the contrast there is because he is now saying that a lot of these people are not here for the right reasons. This woman came here for the right reasons. She touched me, and I felt that distinctly from everybody else.
Well, wait a minute. What about the centurion? Because I've got a sick slave. Jesus says, your faith is cured. That's okay. He didn't have to touch. There was no touch. He thinks he has to.
Well, he didn't have to touch this woman either. She touched him.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, I'd like to know what's going on here. What's the role of faith? Faith is our faith.
Well, okay. Let me. I'll recap this and move on. But I want to catch Carolyn's point here. So maybe
Going to say the same thing. He could have not said anything. She still would have been healed.
right.
Okay, so I think the faith is what he wanted to.
All right. So okay. So let me recap.
And so it was illegal for her to be in that crowd. It was illegal for her to touch him.
Right. Exactly. Right. Which is what. Thank you, because that's the trick. Only 1 minute too early because I was going to recap and then transition on that. Yes, this woman shouldn't even be there. She's unclean, and she's going to teach her to touch Jesus. I mean, wrong, violated every social norm. But again, this woman had faith in who Jesus was and what he could do. The evangelists in their gospels are contrasting Jairus, this woman, and we're going to see a couple blind men in a moment, Lord willing. Uh, they have genuine faith in contrast to the nation of Israel. That's the big point. Now, when we express our faith in Jesus Christ in a saving way, the Spirit indwells us, and it is He regenerates us in that process. It's a supernatural exchange. Um, we know that that faith from the Scriptures is something that God provides by grace. So we have God's grace. It's always within the context of God's grace because He doesn't have to heal anybody. He doesn't have to save anybody. He doesn't have to forgive anybody. But He does because He's gracious. The mechanism, and that's probably, I don't want to use conceptually, the mechanism that God uses is faith. But, and these people are expressing a genuine faith in who Jesus is, and specifically as a result of who he is, what he can do. And as a result, God responds, in this case, Jesus Christ responds to faith. And so if this woman didn't believe and touched Jesus, nothing would have happened. But because she believes and acted on that faith, Jesus responded and healed her. But in somehow, he did this in a way without, where he expressed, who touched me? In a way that seemed like he didn't know. And this is where you'll read notes like MacArthur and everything else. And we all struggle with this balance of Jesus being both fully God and fully man. I can't solve that. I'm not going to make an excuse and say Jesus absolutely knew because he's God, and so he, just said this because he wanted the woman to call the woman out or draw attention or whatever. Um, but I will just say, for me, I emphasize on things like this that we're dealing with someone who is fully God, never ceases to be God, but yet at times, in some unfathomable way, limits his exercise of divine attributes because he's fully human as well. Yeah, Jack.
Okay, what about Peter walking on the water?
That's next week. Okay, go ahead. Jack.
Christ, being God, gave up certain divine rights. And so the question comes out, could this be a parable, not a parable, but an event, supporting our describe how is divinity actually happening? Logos, is it empowering him, or is it spirit?
I don't know which part of the Trinity was enabling Jesus to heal people. I would say that it's just the Trinity. I don't like splitting the Trinity up. I don't think that's a concept that's a good path to go down. Um, we have one God in three persons, and no, I know, but I mean, we're starting to. I just live being accepting that I'm mentally uncomfortable that there's more than I can understand. Because any way I do that, if I were to put it in writing, it would be blasphemous, right? I mean, I don't know how you divide it or even try to frame it. We can think about it, but I'm like, I think that's the point, is God is bigger than us and he's greater than us and we can't understand it. And the fact that he became humanity is even more incomprehensible. and then he's gonna die, right? And he's gonna rise again. And so, I think we don't wanna lose the point in some of these things that we can't fully explore and understand, which is there were people in Israel who genuinely believed in Jesus Christ as their Messiah, and that he could heal them. Yeah. Yeah.
So he was breaking the law,
Right.
highlight, just like he did with Sabbath. Where laws are overpassing, and she has the faith to understand the laws.
No, I don't think so. I mean, we gotta be it could have been here's the thing. She had been through a lot. She's gone through 12 years. There's no hope, no cure. There might be, Jesus is here. This is my last hope. I need to get to Jesus. I need to get to, and if you know what, they throw me out of the synagogue or they throw me out of whatever, at this point, who cares? I know who this person is. I know who he can help me. I just need to get to him. I think that's much more in play, right? Um, we see that sometimes with stories of people that have a child that's not well, and there's a doctor in some part of the country, and it's like they'll do anything they have to get an appointment with that doctor. It's kind of, I think that's probably the picture. And I think that mindset is probably just trumping, yeah, okay, I'm breaking the law, right? But what am I going to do? Jesus isn't going to come out into the leper camp and come see me.
I was gonna say, yeah, that's from her perspective, but her point was from Jesus' perspective is making sure he's still breaking down those walls of legalism in the Jewish faith versus what true faith really is. That's all she was trying to say. I get your perspective of why she did it, but Jesus' perspective may have been a little different. Of yeah, I'm still gonna keep breaking down these walls and show you that the legalism is not what the faith is. I am the faith. You're the faith. This is the faith.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's the point here. No, I wouldn't go there. I would say, again, we don't want to lose the context of what's happening. Context is always the governor. The context is there's still faithful believers in Israel. There's faithful Jews. There's not many, but there's some. There's a whole crowd that doesn't believe, and we're going to see that next week. But there's still a handful that do. And that's the overarching message here that the Gospels are trying to highlight is even though Israel has rejected their Messiah, and soon their Messiah is going to reject them temporarily, there are still some that have faith in Christ, in Jesus, as the Messiah, and they look to him, and Jesus has mercy and compassion on them. And I think that we don't want to lose that. We can get overly, in some of the details, and the details are important. I don't want to minimize them. But when we get into the theological things, or we start thinking about what motives might have been that aren't recorded, then we don't know. You know what I'm saying? And we're getting into, you know, again, speculating. Now, I'll do some of that next week, but I think there's maybe a little bit more of a principle there for it.
So with that, typically when you're touched by somebody that she got healed, he stayed.
That's true. And then we can get, and it would be impossible for Jesus to be unclean, right? I mean, so yeah. All right. Interesting conversation. We will not complete our lesson today, but next week we will. And the thing is, I don't want to shortchange some of this. The main thing is the beheading of John the Baptist and Herod's messed up family. I do want to that. Um, all right, so let me shut off the stream and then I'll pray and wrap up for us. What happened? This is streaming. Fine. Let me just shut it off. I'll pray. It might be on. Heavenly Father, we thank you in some of our lively discussion. We thank you that you're bigger than us. We thank you that there are things that we don't understand about how your humanity and your divinity work together. And Lord, we are thankful that even though the nation of Israel as a whole at this point and the crowd are rejecting you, that there were still faithful Jews there. It's an example for us, model for us, as we live in a world that rebels against you, rejects you everywhere that we go. But yet there are those that are faithful and follow you. And Lord, we thank you to be a part of that group and pray that we would be great examples of faith like the people we looked at today. Come, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Make myself clear.
Hold on one second. I want to see if I can. Yeah, let me just see if I can make sure we're not streaming anymore. Okay. All right, where can I shut down? Hold on one second. I'm sorry. Shut down. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so Peter walked on the water.